I'll be completely honest here. Do you know which team I think is least likely to qualify for the next World Cup? It's Russia. However, there's another country that I don't see making the tournament. One that, although quick to adapt to the game of rugby, found its door of opportunity violently slammed on its face through both internal and external troubles around the sport. This is the story of the Ivory Coast and why I don't think we'll be seeing them play in Australia by 2027. If you're like me, then the 1995 Rugby World Cup is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Ivory Coast's involvement in rugby. Playing in Pool D against Scotland, France and Tonga respectively, questions had already been raised on how deserving they were to play at the tournament.
I've got to be honest with you, I watched them training this week. I don't know how they got here, unless they're like the Fijians, and once somebody blows a whistle and they've got the ball in their hands and they go absolutely mental, but I can't see it. They look so laid back, and I really doubt the general fitness of some of them as well.
Full time, 89-0 to Scotland. Despite the heavy loss, I don't think it's entirely fair to say that the Ivory Coast were undeserving of being at the World Cup. The first recorded rugby match in the Ivory Coast was in 1946, shortly after the end of World War II, played by two teams consisting of French Army expats and a ball that was crafted from an old car tyre. The sport was then further pushed in the nation by French schoolmasters and workers who moved there when the country was a colony of France. Côte d'Ivoire then gained independence in 1960, and a year later the Ivorian Rugby Federation was founded. Unfortunately, growth of the sport stagnated at this time because most rugby players in the country were French expats that went home. The sport was kept alive by a handful of passionate Ivorians, one of which was a man by the name of François Daly, who's recognised as a founding father of the Ivorian Rugby Federation and is also hailed as the man that helped them get to their first ever Rugby World Cup. The Ivory Coast gained full IRB membership in 1990, and they played their first ever international game shortly afterwards against Zimbabwe in a 22-9 loss in Harare. By the time the 1995 World Cup qualifiers were coming around, a lot of French-based players began taking interest in playing for the national team, and that's now something that other French colonies take advantage of. This meant that by the time the 1995 World Cup squad was formed, it consisted of mainly Ivorian-born but French-based players. Now, something that I can't emphasise enough is that the Ivory Coast deserved their place in the World Cup. In the qualifiers for 1995, they beat Tunisia and Morocco in the first stage before snatching narrow wins against both Namibia and Zimbabwe, only having a 2-day turnaround to do it in as well. At the time, beating Zimbabwe was considered a huge upset. They were World Cup regulars, and the Ivory Coast was massive underdogs going into that game. We'll talk about Zim in a future video. This game unfortunately gave a negative opinion to the public on the Ivory Coast as a rugby team, but I don't think that's entirely fair, considering that this was the first time that they'd ever played a Tier 1 side. There was a clear lack of experience at this level, there was a clear difference in quality, and the thing is, this team, they gave them a good run for their money within the first 10 to 15 minutes, implementing a smart kicking tactic as well as nearly getting 5 points on the board early on. Game 2 was against France and showed a much improved performance from Les Elephants, conceding 35 points less than the last game and scoring 18 points of their own, including 2 tries, their first ever at a World Cup. The final score was 54-18, and the side could start to hold their heads high in pride as they showed that they were learning and improving day by day. Just a side note, if anybody knows where I can get my hands on a 90s Ivory Coast rugby jersey, let me know, because these things are stunning. They are so gorgeous. I would love to have my hands on one of them. The final pool game was against Tonga. Once again, it was a much improved performance, losing 29-11, showing that they had made quite a fair bit of progress. There's just one big problem, and that's that this game isn't remembered for the rugby. It's remembered for the negative side of the game. Going down after 3 minutes from the bottom of a ruck, winger Max Brito was paralysed from the neck down and spent the rest of his life as a quadriplegic. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what happened and how, well, tough Max's life was after that point, but let's just say there was negative effects on all sides, and that this should have been a massive lesson from World Rugby over safety as well as player welfare from that point onwards. A lot of people blamed Max's injury on the lack of experience that the Ivory Coast had at a rugby tournament of that level, and to that I say that's complete bullshit. Have a look at this ruck from the Scotland Ivory Coast game. It's a complete mess. There's bodies all over the place, people are getting stood on, it's chaos in a nutshell. I for one am so glad that this kind of rucking has been stamped out of the game. Don't listen to what all these old boys are saying about how we need to go back to the old days of free-for-all rucking, because as you can see, it was unsafe back then, and it would be even more unsafe now with heavier, fitter, and more powerful players coming in. What happened to Max Brito could have happened to any player in that World Cup tournament, and it's a shame that it had such a negative effect on his life from that point onwards. Once the tournament was over, the aforementioned door of opportunity was closed, and there were two reasons for this. Firstly, Max Brito's injury caused a major reaction along the country. Parents and players alike were put off the sport out of fear of this injury being replicated, and the playing numbers dropped. The second major issue was that throughout the 90s, the Ivory Coast was seeing a complete political meltdown. Civil unrest was boiling over into the new millennia after a military coup in 1999, and from 2002 to 2007, the First Ivorian War took place. This was then followed by the Second Ivorian Civil War, which was in 2010 to 2011, meaning that essentially the entire decade just consisted of wars. Hundreds of thousands of Ivorians were misplaced as a result, thousands were dead, and sporting societies across the country were more or less put to a complete halt. Qualifying attempts as a result have been a complete disaster since 1995, and the Ivory Coast have not even come close to even a repechage spot. In an interview with World Rugby in 2018, then president of the federation, Tano Oitano Elvis, said that they were looking for better rugby infrastructure around the country, including training facilities and also playing fields, in order for current players to have better practicality with the sport. The Ivory Coast is what we call a targeted nation by World Rugby, which means that they hope to see them in future World Cups and are giving them an extra injection of funding off of this promised merit. And look, there has been some decent breakthroughs in recent years. There's been the crack system, there's been an improvement in playing numbers, as well as apparently 600 professional players. I don't know how big that number is post-COVID, but yeah, apparently there's 600 professional players in the Ivory Coast. And what this has basically meant is that they've finally rebuilt a foundation from everything that was torn apart since the wars and since Max Brito's injury. So let's talk about the most recent World Cup qualifying campaign, and also why I don't think that they're going to be making it to 2027. The first game of their 2023 qualifiers contradicts pretty much everything I've just said about them not making it to 2027. They beat Namibia 24-13, so they do have potential, but then they went on to lose 19-24 to Madagascar and finished second in their pool stages. This meant they then went into the quarterfinals up against Zimbabwe and lost 38-11. Overall, it was a good run, however it was inconsistent. Beating Namibia is a huge upset in any context for the Ivory Coast, and it shows that they've still got potential to make it to these tournaments. But here's why they won't. So the worst kept secret in the world is that World Rugby has expanded the latest World Cup to 24 teams, and out of these 24 teams, there is still only one allocated slot for African teams, which, let's be honest here, is most likely going to be taken up by Namibia. The only other door for opportunity is 2 repechage spots, and this is when things get stupid. Only one of these repechage spots is actually playable for an African team, and this means that they're essentially just playing with the same qualifying system as before the World Cup expansion. The other problem is that the Ivory Coast, they've got a long way to go in terms of player development, making sure that the squad is strong enough to compete against the top sides for one of these 2 potential spots in the World Cup, considering when they went out in the last tournament, finishing 6th overall. I'll be making a video in future about this World Cup qualifying expansion, which sides get new allocated slots, and also why I don't think it's that practical or productive for the future of World Rugby. But again, that's a future video. Let's get back to this subject. So here's the road that the Ivory Coast has to go down in order to get a repechage spot, assuming again that Namibia win the African slotted space. Firstly, they have to finish runners-up in the Africa Cup. Once they've done that, then they get placed into the later stages of the repechage spots. They play 3 other teams. For the sake of argument, we'll say that these teams are Canada, South Korea, and Brazil. After that, they have to make sure that they finish top of a pool table against these sides, and once they've done that, then they're guaranteed a spot in the next World Cup. This essentially means that while they're getting more game time as a team, as well as more prize money from World Rugby from making it that far in the tournament, there's still a high and likely chance that they won't get to the World Cup, considering how many opponents they have to face. And with one loss, that might be enough to get knocked out of the tournament overall. So why am I making this video ultimately? Well, aside from the fact that it's in the Where Are They Now series, there's also just a fascinating story about such a young and yet history-rich union that I feel needs to be covered. Despite all the political turmoil, setbacks by their own unfortunate set of events, and the lack of funding from World Rugby, the Ivory Coast National Rugby Union has been kept alive through passionate fans of the sport, patriotic Ivorians coming back from France to up the standards of the team. And if we're being honest here, these guys have been punching above their weight, even despite the fact that they've not made it to the World Cup in almost 30 years. Considering how bare-boned their infrastructure is, surely it's time that World Rugby pumped actual money into them. Hell, why not develop an actual national training centre for their team? I would personally go down there, World Rugby, as your ambassador and film the building of it, the construction, the opening. Let's put money into these guys because they've got potential and they've also shown that they've got heart. This is a team that should have been hyped up a lot more than they were in 1995, much like we hype up Los Condores for their awesome run of form in the recent World Cup, or Uruguay, or any other team that has broken through in recent years. So I guess what I can only say is, let's all get behind the Ivory Coast, this World Cup qualifying. Let's see what happens. I'm on the Ivory Coast.